A nice light topic to finish the day on, the future of energy. Mate, you can dive far deeper than what I did in that presentation, that is for sure. So look, obviously super happy to have Ted and Chris on here. I'll let them provide an introduction to yourself, but I just cannot stop thinking about this energy issue as far as what is actually required for going forward and what it looks like for Australia, and also just seeing what's happening around the world. So there's obviously a bunch of questions I'm going to be asking. So, but as a first point, Ted, do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself? Or when I say quick, give a full introduction to yourself because you're a legend. And same with you, Chris.
I'll try to be quick. So Ted Dow, Paddington Street Finance. We're a private capital, private debt fund investing in emerging corporates. We have a pretty large focus on clean energy sustainability. Prior to that role, I was the chief investment officer at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is a $32 billion sovereign wealth fund, one of the largest in the world, and it's right here in Australia. We invest in a variety of verticals and areas, but basically what we're trying to do is to help emerging corporates accelerate their growth trajectory. We do that in a probably cowardly way, I would say. We're cowardly venture capitalists because we're looking for safe places to invest. Well, we're pretty conscious that, well, that's what we are. So, I mean, the best way to make a small fortune is to start with a big one. So we try to avoid that. We invest mostly in debt securities. If you look under the hood, most venture capitalists will have a liquidation preference, which essentially means they're investing in preference shares. We're not that different, but we carry a different label. We just launched a $100 million grant matching debt secured program. So for companies out there that are receiving grants, we will help you accelerate those grant payments, which are usually dispersed over the course of about 3 or 4 years. We can bring all of that forward and help you fund yourself today in a non-dilutive fashion. That's us in a nutshell.
Thanks, Ted. Chris Flavell. I'm an investor, ex-investment banker, focused very similar to Ted on followed the lead that Steve made into the private credit side. So now focusing on providing liquidity and debt into investments, but investment and investment advising, impact areas of renewables and health. I'm an LP for Energy Lab, which is a startup incubator for early stage renewable projects. And I've got an investment in a small power station in New Zealand, hydro power station in New Zealand. So that's my claim to renewables.
He's forgotten his whole investment banking background, which was built around the 90s and 2000s around energy. But we'll get to that, Chris. All right, so first question I'll have, and I'll start with the light topics first. So Australia's pledged to cut emissions by 43% by 2030 and 62 to 70% by 2035 and reach net zero by 2050. How credible is the current trajectory towards those targets?
Not very. Not very, but the numbers are still astounding. I think the federal government has spent something like $70 billion on decarbonisation and clean energy since 2023. And the numbers are going up, they're doubling every year. There's a lot of unreliable numbers out there, I think. I think if you look at Bloomberg, they're saying that investment in clean energy in Australia is something like $13 to $14 billion a year. I think that's very narrowly defined. That's just power generation. If you look at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, they invested $5 billion on their own last year, and that's supporting projects of over $25 billion. So there's huge numbers going in, but nobody in the world is meeting their targets. Those figures have been going up by double-digit percentages every year, and they're only going to accelerate. And I don't know what you're seeing, Chris, but I can feel it accelerating. I can feel the weight of money and the rush to catch up and deliver on those targets. But I don't think they will be delivered. But what's interesting is the one thing that keeps everybody honest is there's a large category of people that believe if they're not delivered, then we all die because oceans boil and the world becomes unlivable.
I think the interesting thing is just what happens with government regulation and overcompensation. So the pendulum swinging one way and then swinging too far the other. So South Australia has last year actually had periods when it was 100% renewable. So rooftop solar, which was incentivised with very high feed-in tariffs, 50 cents a kilowatt hour, basically accelerated rooftop solar to a position where, and I think, Ted, you were saying something like 70% for all of Australia at one time during 2024. Just one point at midday, of course. So our big issue in terms of transition is how you store that rooftop solar and what we need to do for looking at all of the various forms of generation. And Australia is the lucky country, again, in terms of the quantity of solar that we have, the conversion rates we have. And so despite the fact that we haven't built the huge Northern Territory solar farm that was going to export to Singapore, there is still massive growth. PV has brought the price down to about 5 cents a unit for PV solar. And battery technologies are going to help fill that intermittent gap, I think, to help get us to that position. But we're all seeing the demand profile for AI negate a whole bunch of that effect.
I feel like I always have a right of retort because I sit in the middle. Yeah, that was risky, Steve. But I'm gonna actually support everything you said. I mean, the one thing that's probably commonly not understood, people like to talk about mega projects, is in this country, most of the solar that we have installed is on rooftops today. It's something like 25 gigawatts. That's almost a third of our total installed capacity. It doesn't speak for a third of our generation because it only operates for about a third of a day. But the renewable energy story in Australia has been all about rooftop solar. And I think the next thing that will help us deliver on those promises will be batteries that get installed in the home on top of that. Much smaller. There's 4 million households today that have solar on their rooftops. There's only about 200,000 that have batteries. But there's scope for huge growth, and that's going to be the next growth engine that may just get us there or will help us to get there. You want to write a retort, Chris?
And just so the support, the federal government support for battery installation, so it's going to support that.
So that leads perfectly to the next question of, you mentioned about solar, and then you mentioned about the role sort of batteries play. And I know, I can't remember what fund, I've read in the AFR the other day, there was a fund manager, that's pretty much going to be their focus going forward, is the combination of solar and energy and batteries, sorry. So, but also, if you're looking at the other domains, whether it be, obviously you've got renewables, gas, hydrogen, nuclear, carbon capture, etc. What's your thoughts on those areas as far as, from a pragmatic perspective, how can they be utilised for, I suppose, providing the energy production that Australia is really going to require?
So until we install a much larger fleet of batteries, and in particular, long-duration storage. So long-duration storage is defined as anything over 8 hours. It's going to be very, very difficult to support the orderly retirement of the coal-fired power fleet, which is a little bit of a challenge because most of those power plants are older than I am. They're 50, 60 years old. They're very, very expensive to run and will be reliant on gas. So I think the next wave that we're going to see will be probably lithium-ion batteries. They are not long-duration storage. So the next challenge for us, if we're going to really decarbonize our energy systems, is we've got to install long-duration storage batteries or else the lights will go out. The system reliability won't be there. The system integrity won't be there. The heavy lifting there is being done by coal and gas right now. So that's one big challenge. It'll happen, but the solution isn't very clear as we sit here today. So Coal's going to be a little bit important. Gas is going to be very important, I think. Hydrogen, I think anyone who's followed energy markets knows that we got very, very, very excited about it in the last couple of years, and that's slowly died down. I will say myself, Andrew Forrest was a big supporter of hydrogen. I thought, well, he's a smart guy. He knows something I don't. And then he's kind of come full circle, and I've worked out, no, he doesn't know anything I don't. He's just worked out it's a little too early for hydrogen. Nuclear, I don't think will ever have a social license in this country. And it's interesting that you mentioned nuclear. I saw it in your slides. But I think we have to draw a distinction between nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. So most nuclear power plants today are nuclear fission. So that's splitting atoms to produce energy. Nuclear fusion is joining atoms. You know, it's a really, really big difference between the two of them. Is nuclear fusion does not produce radioactive waste. It produces a bit of hydrogen, a bit of water. And when you see Microsoft and Google getting behind nuclear, they are putting a lot of money into nuclear fusion. We could rely on nuclear fission. My issue there is if we're going to do that, then we're reliant upon the Chinese and the Russians, who are the global leaders in that. Probably not a brilliant idea to rely on the Chinese and the Russians when you have a weaponizable source of energy. So I don't think we're going to see, people get very, very excited about the theoretical solution that's offered by nuclear, but there are just so many impediments that stand in its way. And even China, which is, you know, they're the global leader in nuclear. They have state-of-the-art nuclear plants. It's only 5% of their energy footprint today. There are forecasts that it may go up to 15%, but every year China steps it back a little bit, and they're absolutely prioritizing solar. I think they install something like 300 times as much solar every year as nuclear. So I don't know if I've left anything out, but I mean, it's really a solar story at the end of the day. I think globally, there's something like USD $2 trillion. It is a $1 trillion opportunity that's going into clean energy. About 30% of that is going into power generation, and 80% of that is solar. So we got a solar story, but as Chris said, the batteries have to follow because solar only generates a third of a day. So what do we do for the other 2/3 of the day? So the next challenge for me is either batteries. It is a user case that nuclear can address, but I don't think there are as many supporters of nuclear as there are of batteries. Brief answer.
So I agree with Ted on almost all of those issues. I think there's a clear difference between fission and fusion, and most of the announcements that are coming out from the US at the moment are around a company called Commonwealth Fusion Services. That's the largest and the most advanced, currently about $1 trillion market cap. And they've made several new investments. I was talking to Ted earlier. Actually, he and I both, without collaboration, both put a little bit of money into. There's several small competitors. So there's half a dozen different fission companies in the US, as well as initiatives in both China, Japan, and Europe, which are focused on that as a technology. The reality is the cost of fission, in terms of my review of it, is still that it's more expensive than traditional forms, and solar still looks to be about sort of 20% of price. And so I think it's going to be the solution here in Australia. So a lot of the work here in Australia is going to be around optimisation of the grid, batteries in the homes, community batteries, rooftop solar on other than residential rooftop, on apartment buildings, on industrial buildings, and so I mean, again, unfortunately, we were early into Alexis, so another wholesale investor company that was looking specifically at grid. And some of the nuances around how this works are actually quite interesting, because a lot of what coal-fired generation did was it actually supported the quality of electricity. So there are things called reactive power, and the actual, so the thing that keeps you at between 250 and 230 volts in terms of the quality of the power. It's important at a delivery level, at a household level or industrial level that's kept in place. And what that requires is greater investment into the transformers that are more locally located. So all of these nuances change the shape of the grid when you don't have distant power stations and long transmission lines to where the power is actually coming from.
What percentage of that cost, obviously nuclear is more expensive, but what percentage of that cost is, sort of wrapped around red tape and regulation to actually get a project or get a site live?
Again, I'd go back to Ted's example of there are a lot smarter people than me who do that. But so when we look at kind of the forest law and how that works, basically with fission you had significantly increasing costs because of that loss of social license. Fusion actually, because there is no waste, it's actually getting fast-tracked approvals. But there is still a significant cost in terms of the technology that's required to hold the deuterium together and actually, so it is a significant capital cost that still needs to come down that same cost curve that batteries need to come down.
Can I jump in there? So I've got anecdotal evidence. If you look at, we talked about Hinkley C in the UK. That, when it's finished, will cost about 50 billion pounds sterling for a 3 gigawatt power plant. That's about 5 times as much as the original forecast, and it took 8 years. Just as a benchmark, and that's red tape. That's your measure of red tape. The red tape's added something like 5 times the cost. But there's also lack of know-how because it's a first-of-a-kind plant. Albeit you had the Chinese involved in that. You had Chinese General Nuclear involved in that. Know-how, capability, but they don't know how to deal with the red tape in the UK. Just as a benchmark for that, let's say you built an equivalent sized solar array. That might be 200 million pounds sterling. That would be a little bit expensive. Let's say you built a 3 gigawatt lithium-ion battery. That might be 2 billion pounds sterling. And then someone out there should go, but that's not fair because if it's solar, it's only operating a third of a day. Okay, so we're up to about 2.5 billion for solar and battery. Let's build them together. And let's triple the size of it so it is an equivalent generation footprint because of the lower capacity factor. We're still at 7.5 billion versus 48 billion. Not a wonderful poster child that encourages you to build more nuclear. And that's not even the most expensive nuclear plant that's been built. That record's held by Vogel in Georgia in the USA. And if you want to read about that one, Google a story that's, I think it's entitled Anatomy of a Disaster. So that probably tells you everything you need to know about how that one went.
Actually, yeah, I've got another anecdote, which is just if you look at municipal solid waste, which was supposed to be, what a great circular economy idea. Sort of, you take waste where there's a gate fee, and you put that into a power plant and generate power from that. And we've got one waste plant over in West Australia that I'm aware of. Just one, just one. The one significant one. There's 1,000 in China, but what they're actually having to do now is they've got to a stage where they're having to pay to top up the waste to get sufficient in because all of the recycling and other things is pulling the high calorific value waste out of those waste streams as you do more in recycling and do so. The reason why we don't have more municipal waste plants that Ted and I both looked at investing in the past is because the economics change and it becomes very difficult to project what the answer is going to be. The one other one that I'll talk about is New Zealand, which native Maori. So what the Jacinda Ardern government over there, it was just so green that the pendulum swung too far in one direction. We closed down all of our coal mines, closed and stopped gas. And what they're doing now is they're having to import coal from Indonesia to store for the one coal-fired plant. So the reality for us, and similar here in Australia, we need gas for some of the industrial manufacturing that goes on. Gas is really the only energy solution for some of them, and so to use that gas for basically low return electricity generation doesn't make sense. We should be preserving the gas and potentially extending the life of some of the coal while doing this transition to, yes, good, green, clean energy. But trying to pick that answer and plan for it is very hard. You actually need just the market to be working transparently to get the right outcome.
And this is for both of you, like what does so we've basically landed on solar and battery, and obviously the role that natural gas will play. What does the role that innovation plays when it comes to solar panels? And I ask that because I'll never forget, I had the opportunity to go to a presentation by Richard Branson, and he mentioned about one of the issues with solar was that often it takes 10 to 20 years from an innovation perspective at the solar panel level to when you actually see it in commercialized sort of markets. What does that time cycle look like now, and also the potential cost reduction cycle look like going forward as more sort of solar panels are manufactured? What's the improvement of quality and efficiency of every bit of sunlight landing on a solar panel converting into energy, and then likewise on the batteries, the innovation cycle for the battery storage as well? Just a nice easy question.
I'm gonna answer your question a little differently to subvert it to a personal, a professional area of interest of mine. I mean, solar is the lowest cost form of energy now, and it's built at such scale that the manufacturing efficiencies are there, and there's constant technological advancements. Batteries will be next. First it was wind, then it was solar. Batteries will be next. They'll get there. The chemistry is a bit more complex. It's going to take some time. They'll get there. What I'm seeing over and over again and very focused on, perhaps because we're more at the early stage, is not so much the hardware solution, because that's just dominated by China and to a lesser extent Korea. Particularly in an Australian context, what you're seeing are software, AI-driven, back to that sort of old chestnut, AI-driven machine learning platforms that are about optimizing those assets, orchestrating the fleet of assets, because you just have so many different distributed energy generation units. How do you coordinate all that? We used to just have like 6 or 7 large coal-fired power stations. Now you've got thousands of different data points of energy generation. You have EVs, you have solar on rooftop, you have batteries. And companies that are making a fist of that and doing quite well, that are local, because we can compete globally here in Australia in that sense. You've got Amber Electric, which is doing really, really good things, both in terms of giving, they're a retailer, they'll give you access to wholesale markets, they'll cut out the middleman, the big four who just trade around the physical position that you create and profit off of your underwriting of their risk position. You've got a company that, by the name of Energy Exemplar, they model energy systems. That was an Adelaide company, started in 1999, was bought by Blackstone, I think, in 2023 in a $1 billion transaction. So you see all of these, Relectrify actually is another one. So Relectrify have a software overlay on the hardware of batteries that is cell-by-cell based. And they can get about a 20 to 30% extra yield out of any given battery with their software. So that's what, I don't know what you're seeing, Chris, but that's kind of the really interesting area that I'm seeing emerging. And when you look at equivalent companies overseas, I think there's a company called Nextracker. And what Nextracker does is it helps solar panels follow and optimize their positioning to the sun. So it's a rotating axis, sort of AI-driven system that basically says the sun's moving, we've got to follow it so we get the highest yield out of our solar panels. That's a $10 billion company. There's another company that I'm sure you've heard of called Kraken, which Origin Energy has an investment in. I read about it. I don't really know why it's so good, but obviously it's a very, very good software platform, because that's worth $10 to $15 billion as well. And it seems to be a customer service platform. Again, it's the overlay over the hardware. So that's really the area to be looking for your next unicorns, because hardware, that's China, that's Korea. It's not going to be us.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting just to see the domination of PV and how that's driven the price down. Batteries is at the top of that curve and is going to come down over time. And the other thing that drives it, of course, is batteries and EVs. And because of the number of EVs that are there, we're now seeing a lot of EVs. And one of the things that we've talked about is, the reuse, what's required for an EV, which we're seeing doubling in terms of the mileage capacity of EVs. That's typically a doubling in terms of storage capacity for the same size as well. So that then goes to what's there and available. But we then can take those EV batteries and use those for home storage because that's a stationary model that where the typical current car battery EV is enough to power your house for 2.5 days. So therefore, you only need sort of a half generating battery to actually keep your house going. So that's at one side. But probably the other thing is as we change, as Ted was saying, as we change from kind of the centrally generated model to something that's the distributed energy system. What becomes more critical is the sensors and the meters. So the other opportunity that's been picked up by PEP is if we look at the metering systems that are in place, and IntelliHub there's two big players in Australia. And the other thing is that all of the data that we have been using historically is around what's generated centrally and distributed centrally without actually capturing what's actually being captured on the solar panels at home. So if you look at the NEM, the National Electricity Market, and look at the data that's there, they need to be able to access what's happening behind the meter and actually understand what's going on so that they now can get the right sort of picture for what's going on. And all of these intricacies then open up opportunities for sensors, for energy monitoring, for better battery control, for virtual power plants, for vehicle to grid. So there's different layers of complexity that start to feed in.
I'm going to jump in again. Do you know what the return on IntelliHub was for Pacific Equity Partners? 80% IRR and a 5 times money multiple for a company that just distributes meters and installs them, old economy company.
Well, that leads on to my next question. So after going through all of that, putting your look at that, so fast, Ted, to hand that back over. Moving on to putting your investor hat on, what do you see as the biggest sort of financial opportunities for yourselves or that you think about participating in when you look at the entire landscape, whether it be sort of upstream or downstream? What do you see as the greatest investment opportunity for investors to participate in?
So last time we were on the stage, we had Alan Hunter, who was here alongside us. And so Alan Hunter is National Renewable Network, which is just very simply batteries and solar panels. And so NRN just closed a $67 million Series A round. So congratulations to Alan.
And also, we're super happy that we worked with him from literally we helped him get his first customer, worked with him at sort of almost pre-seed seed stage, and Chris actually advised and mentored him along the way as well. So hats off to you too.
But so that's one. I think we found out that we were into fusion, but that's really just dabbling and trying to understand what's going on in markets. Personally, I think that a lot of it's around kind of the software stuff, the battery stuff, and metering. I think it's around the edge of where Australia is competitive. So Australia, South Australia has the most rooftop solar of anywhere globally. So if we look at states in the world, it's basically South Australia, then Queensland, then New South Wales, I think, then Hawaii, then California. So we will see the greatest change and adaptation in terms of what happens about distributed electricity systems and the changes that need to occur to the grid and to everything else. And I think that's actually a good opportunity for us in Australia for renewable energy.
I think for me, I see 2 categories. And one I've already alluded to, it's the software element. I can think of so many companies in the orchestration, optimization. I've already mentioned a few. And I guess I have nothing new to say because the other category is the National Renewable Network, so your aggregation plays. And that's a very common playbook that I think both of us would have seen rolled out over and over. I mean, IntelliHub's an example. They're installing meters, household by household. It's a massive growth play, and it leverages the forces of the energy transition. You can't have solar on your rooftop if you don't have a smart meter, and they're still growing. You go back a few more years, there are many other examples. Another company was called Energy Developments Corporation. They harnessed fugitive emissions from coal mines, installed basically microgrids in every single coal mine, built about 300 megawatts of assets under management. Eventually, they were taken over by an infrastructure fund in a multi-billion-dollar transaction. So these aggregation plays are another surefire, certain way to build a company that's meaningful off the back of this growth. So I think it's software, aggregation plays. You know, there's so many other areas that I think we look at, but things like hydrogen, biofuels, they're difficult, they're small, they're bespoke.
Interesting. None of you have only you mentioned wind once, but outside of that, it hasn't been covered at all.
Well, it's interesting because solar really seems to be turning wind into more of a niche application. I mean, wind is still wonderful. It's not as cheap as solar anymore. But the permitting is very difficult. They're very big projects. Solar's modular. You know, I can put solar on your roof. I can use the same solar panels and build a utility scale power plant. You can't do that with wind. And the economics of wind are such that if you've ever seen the turbines that are getting deployed now, you have to clear highways, you know, just to get the blades along the highways. They're just massive. But wind is, I mean, the old adage was that wind and solar fit together because when the sun's not shining, the wind's probably blowing. That we seem to be moving away from that now. But that's just how things unfold. I mean, the transition, it always unfolds far, far faster than anybody ever expects it will. But the shape that it takes is always different than anyone ever predicts because I don't think anyone would have possibly imagined that all of the new renewable energy installations today, 80% is solar. But that's because solar it's so modular, it gets cheaper and cheaper. You can put it on rooftops, it can be utility scale. And that's another reason I kind of I find it hard to believe in nuclear. It's not modular. You're not going to put one on your rooftop, or at least I'm not.
All right. So final question is, if you're sort of looking 5 to 10 years ahead, obviously cost of living sort of, everyone's talking about on the political aspect, they were talking about the promise of, $275 cheaper electricity. You've got a whole bunch of political factors, a whole bunch of technology factors, innovation factors, geopolitical factors, etc., sort of taking place in this area of energy right now. Going forward 10 years, what does the cost of energy look like? What does the grid look like? What does the ultimate solutions, which win, look like? Take your time.
Are we out of time?
Yeah, we are.
Why is everyone
Listen, I think that technology will keep on driving these costs down. Other than, I mean, the thing that affects wind has been regulation. It's not in my backyard. It's sort of stopping offshore wind. So the bit about politics and regulation and social license, I think, affects all of these things. But accessibility to power and price of power, I think, is coming down. Accessibility to everything else, to health, to AI, and everything else is sort of pushing all of these things much, down to an individual level, to everything being far more accessible, going out to, the rest of the world, developing countries, and I think because of what we're talking about, it's actually a bright future.
I think we've got a long journey. I think we've got a long journey because basically right now we're suffering from the fact that we haven't invested in the generation side of our energy markets, at least in Australia, for maybe 50 or 60 years. So of course, coal-fired generation is cheap
because it was built 60 years ago. The capital costs were recovered a long, long, long time ago. And we're not going to replace like for like. We're not going to build new coal-fired power stations. No private sector financier is going to finance that. No private sector or public sector equity party will finance that, not in their right mind. So we're transitioning to renewable energy, and as we're doing that, there's another great big build. Unfortunately, to me, that means you need a price signal for that to happen, and that means energy is going to be expensive, I think, for a long time to come. I think that until we get the storage solution right,